There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home.
He is not attempting to critique everybody. He's only critiquing a certain radical subsection, as opposed to, the people who actually destroyed his presidency at every point. George W. Bush goes to the 9/11 memorial in Shanksville, and he proceeds to say some very, very nice things, and then he says one thing that ends up being the headline, of course, because he was trying to say something unifying, and he failed. So he starts off by talking about how Americans, when we are forced together, are exceptional, which of course is true.
20 years ago, terrorists chose a random group of Americans on a routine flight to be collateral damage in a spectacular act of terror. The 33 passengers and 7 crew of Flight 93 could have been any group of citizens selected by fate. In a sense, they stood in for us all. The terrorists soon discovered that a random group of Americans is an exceptional group of people facing an impossible circumstance. They comforted their loved ones by phone, braced each other for action, and defeated the designs of evil.
Okay, and all of that was true. And this is the world that George W. Bush, I think, wishes to occupy. Frankly, it's a world I wish to occupy as well. I mean, I think that what happened on Flight 93 is a great indicator of what Americans are when put to the test. George W. Bush continued along these lines, and he talked a little bit about the men and women who have served in harm's way. And you start to see the first inklings here of why the Bush presidency, which, again, I think that Bush in many ways was a man of principle, but the Bush presidency was a disappointing failure in many ways. And I think one of the reasons was because, again, he just did not defend his own policies. He did not defend what he was doing. So here he was. It's 20 years later. We've now surrendered in Afghanistan to the very people who perpetrated 9/11. And George W. Bush has had not a word to say about that, really. He's had not one word about the policy. He's sat aside. Well, Joe Biden surrendered the entire country back to the exact people who did 9/11. I mean, like the exact people who did 9/11. He's had nothing to say about that. Instead, he has sort of comforting words for the members of the military, which is fine. But where is he when it comes to the actual serious questions of policy?
Let me speak directly to veterans and people in uniform. The cause you pursued at the call of duty is the noblest America has to offer. You have shielded your fellow citizens from danger. You have defended the beliefs of your country and advanced the rights of the downtrodden. You have been the face of hope and mercy in dark places. You have been a force for good in the world. Nothing that has followed, nothing, can tarnish your honor or diminish your accomplishments. To you and to the honored dead, our country is forever grateful.
Has a rather oblique critique of the Biden foreign policy in Afghanistan. Okay, so if you're going to do a unity speech, then what you really need to talk about are unifying principles, right? You need to talk about what brings America together. And George W. Bush did many of those things in that speech. But if you're going to critique, then the critique has to be pointed and it has to be specific, or at least it has to be broad enough to encompass the big problems in American society. People on the right, I think, responded with the Trump era because of the Obama era, but also because of the Bush era, as we'll see in just one second. Because here is George W. Bush. This is the clip that made all the headlines, right? It wasn't all of the talk about unity. It wasn't all the talk about bringing Americans together. It was this line from George W. Bush that brought all the commentary. This is the line where he compares the January 6th rioters to the 9/11 hijackers.
We have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
Okay, so everybody took this as a critique of the 1/6 rioters. Now, it's possible to read it as a broader critique than that, right? That he's talking about white supremacists, or that he is talking about Antifa, or that he is talking about Black Lives Matter. The problem is, of course, that he released a statement in favor of Black Lives Matter last June, in which he talked about systemic American racism and all of the rest of the left-wing buzzwords. And it is also possible to say that the 1/6 rioters did something evil. I have said that. many, many times, I think that storming the Capitol building on the basis of a falsehood, both that the election was stolen and that the election results were capable of being overturned after having been certified at the state level, that was all a lie. That was not true. And they stormed the Capitol building. To compare those people still to the 9/11 hijackers who literally murdered 3,000 Americans. The only American who was actually killed at the Capitol on 1/6, like died at the Capitol on 1/6 because of direct action by another human being. The only person who actually died because of that was Ashley Babbitt, right, who was shot at the Capitol, and she was one of the rioters. Okay, that is not remotely the same thing as the 9/11 hijackers, either in their aims. I mean, the goal of the 9/11 hijackers was to completely overthrow the system of the United States, not because of a quote-unquote stolen election or anything like that, but because they didn't believe in elections. They believe in full-on Sharia law, right? They wanted the kind of governance that you see in Afghanistan. The comparison fails on nearly every level. But what's more important is I think George W. Bush thought that he was saying something unifying here, right? Which is that attacks on American institutions and attacks on American principles are unacceptable across the board. But the feeling that people get on the right is that he doesn't mean it across the board. And by the way, that was the feeling on the left as well. Because if the left thought that he meant that across the board, if they thought that he equally meant the 1/6 rioters and the people who burned down American cities last summer, resulting in at least $5 billion in property damage, about $2 billion of it insured, that if they felt that he was applying that to Antifa with the same sort of alacrity that he was applying that to white supremacists, then there might be some sort of unity. But they don't feel like that. And neither does the left. And the reason you can tell the left doesn't feel like that is because they were giving him the strange new respect treatment. And this is what's truly galling. After 8 years of defending George W. Bush and his policies, after 8 years of going to political battle for the Bush administration on behalf of many of their policies, right? I disagreed with George W. Bush a lot, and sometimes I'd critique him. But if you go back and read my columns, I defended many of George W. Bush's big moves when he wouldn't defend himself. After 8 years of that, to feel as though the ex-president of the United States, who you defended, only emerges to critique one side of the political aisle, even if that side deserves critique, even if those radicals deserve critique, but he is not attempting to critique everybody. He's only critiquing a certain group, a certain radical subsection of a movement, as opposed to, the people who actually destroyed his presidency at every point. And then to receive the strange respect from the same people who spent 8 years declaring him a warmonger and a bad human being, that's how you get Trump. That's how you get Trump, and you deserve Trump. Right? That's how it comes to that. And you can see the left celebrating Bush. Right? You have Joe Biden, who says that, Bush made a great speech about who we are. Why do you think Joe Biden is celebrating George W. Bush? He spent years ripping on George W. Bush. In 2008, when Biden was running alongside Barack Obama, he labeled John McCain a continuation of the horrific Bush era. That was the main line. George W. Bush was so bad, and John McCain will be more of that. I mean, Joe Biden spent years trashing George W. Bush, but now he's very happy with George W. Bush, which makes you think, has Joe Biden changed? Or is George W. Bush just paying homage to a delusional conciliation that does not exist in American politics? Here is Joe Biden.
I thought that President Bush made a really good speech today. Genuinely good speech about who we are. We're not. The core of who we are is not divided.
The core of who we are is not divided, says Joe Biden. This is the part where, again, I think Bush is misreading the situation. And I think a lot of the right-wing establishment, the so-called conservative establishment, is misreading the moment. I'll explain more of this in just 1 second, because when Joe Biden said that he was trying to generate unity when he was inaugurated, I said at the time, we still have to define what he means by unity. By unity, does he mean they were going to attempt to come together around common principles and leave people alone, let them live their lives? Or by unity, does he mean you shut the hell up and I will tell you what to do? And it is extremely obvious at this point that Joe Biden means the latter. And if George W. Bush means the former, then unity does not mean the same thing to George W. Bush that it means to Joe Biden. And yet, George W. Bush is using the exact same language, which is a dangerous thing to do. It obscures clarity. It makes things opaque. And not only that, it grants weapons to the people who actually wish to infringe upon your freedoms each and every day and divide Americans each and every day. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.